So hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Again, today we have Christoffer Døhlen as a guest here. We are having a series of discussions once per week. And in our last discussion, which you can see on Christoffer's channel, I will put the link into this video description. We talked about how the problem of too much legislation and regulation accumulating could maybe be addressed. And it was a very interesting discussion. I really can recommend it. And we had a couple of suggestions. And one of these suggestions has to do with personal responsibility. So in this case, it would be that people that work in the government can do a bad job, but they will not be held personally responsible. But only maybe the government in general or just nobody at all will be held responsible for this particular failure. And we wanted to talk about this problem a little bit more in detail today, because I think this is also an important aspect that should be improved about the current governmental structure. So please, Christoffer, yes, take it from here and let us know how you came to regard this problem as important.
Right, yeah, so it began with a tragedy which happened here in Norway, not far away from where I live. Some disaster where the ground at the bottom of some houses locally here in Akershus, a place in Norway, collapsed completely. So the basic ground just collapsed. So the houses went down and some people are missing and probably dead. So it's a huge tragedy which happened very recently, just I think it was yesterday. And the interesting thing is that when the house builders, when they built the house on this very risky ground, which could collapse at any time, the local government said that it was completely safe. You could just build on here. It's nothing risky. It's nothing that can happen here as a disaster. They just told the house builders, you can just build here. Nothing will happen. It will go completely safe. But as we saw, that was completely false. So it seems like the local government did some very, very grave errors when they sort of geologically investigated the area and tried to find out whether the ground was safe to build upon. And the problem, I thought, was that those particular individuals which did those very grave errors, which ultimately led to this tragedy that happened recently, they are not personally held responsible for those errors that they committed. So I thought even if the victims involved would sue the government for committing these grave errors, those particular individuals involved, they would not bear the burden personally with what they did. Perhaps they win at suing the government, but then the government would just use taxpayers' money to pay them or something. So I just reflected on the fact that it's a very central problem to the governmental structure in general, at least here in Norway and probably in many other countries as well, that there are many bureaucrats who do very, very bad decisions which affect a whole lot of people and has a lot of consequences. But those bureaucrats, they don't need to think those things through because they don't bear the burden of that personally. It's not like people, the victims involved, can sue them and then they need to pay from their own pocket for what they did. Rather, people have to sue this general abstract entity that we call government without actually affecting the people who caused disasters or tragedies. And I thought it would be much improvement, at least in theory, to make sure that many of the bureaucrats involved in government which make bad decisions, that they in some way or another could be personally held responsible and liable for the damage that they do on others, because as of today they are not held personally responsible, and that's a very bad incentive it makes it very easy for them to make bad decisions. And that's happening all through the government structure, in schools, in government healthcare, in the government welfare system, in the whole system of bureaucracy in general. We see people making bad decisions, but they can just sort of externalize the costs and burdens, so they don't have to bear them themselves, and therefore they can make a whole lot of bad and risky decisions without having to think them through. So I just had this thought that this is a very central problem within the government.
Yes, yes. Thank you for this topic suggestion. I really think it is it's a very important thing to talk about, and it is really a structural problem in our society at the moment. And as you said, of course, everybody can think about this for himself. If you, for your job, have to decide whether or not some houses can be built somewhere, or the school should change this or not change that, but you personally will feel no consequence whether or not this decision turns out to be good or bad. For you, your life will just continue the same. Then you have a strong incentive to just take the path of least resistance, so that you can finish early and go home and enjoy your weekend. So it really is a bad incentive structure if anyone is not held responsible for the errors that, or for the errors they commit personally. And of course, you see in the free market, in private businesses, people are all the time held responsible for the errors they commit. Now, also, I just noticed while I was saying this that sometimes if the corporation is large enough, then in the higher ranks of the corporation, this principle is also not so much observed anymore. So you can be a CEO and of a huge bank, for example, and make really bad decisions that will, in the long term, affect this bank negatively. Maybe even it will go out of business and many people will lose their job, but you still take a big bonus and go on to your next job or consulting assignment as if nothing has happened. So it would also be interesting if this is just an effect of when a structure becomes so large that the top is somehow almost completely separated from the bottom. But I think it is really a problem, and I don't know the solution. Maybe we can just search for some ways to improve this, because also an important problem is how can you decide whether or not someone made an error, like that this person should have considered this fact but didn't, as opposed to saying, well, this was too complicated and no one could have known this before the problem actually occurred. And so we also don't want this personal responsibility to become a political weapon where one party can use it to destroy members of the other party by just blaming everything on them and then dragging them in front of court. So yes, what do you think of these points?
Right. Yeah, you point out some important, you could say, difficult dilemmas when it comes to what are we going to do about it. Because as we were saying, we could clearly identify that the lack of personal responsibility is a serious problem. As I mentioned, with the geological disaster that happened very recently, but also many other scandals within the government. Like relatively recently, some months ago, there was a huge scandal in the Norwegian welfare state where several innocent people were sent to prison because the welfare system mistakenly accused them of perhaps, I think it was, not paying enough taxes or getting too much welfare money, when they actually didn't do that. It was just some bureaucratic error within the welfare system. And the effect was that several innocent people had to go to jail for that. And it became this huge scandal, and the government had got a lot of trouble. However, the bureaucrats personally were not held liable. They were not personally held responsible for those very, very grave errors. So we see this all over. And as you mentioned, it's a very good point that this problem is not solely happening within the government. We also see this in huge multinational corporations. So in a very huge corporation, if the corporation does huge damage, for instance, you can say pollute the air or a local river, the people involved might sue that corporation and perhaps they win and get some money. But for instance, the CEO involved, which actually made the decision, he is not personally held liable for his decision to pollute the air or the river, even if his decisions led to tragic deaths of innocent people. So I think this fact that some corporations are judicially kept away from personal liability. I think it's called limited liability with these corporations, that the CEO has a very limited form of liability when something happens. I think that's a very huge factor in why you have so many huge multinational corporations. So there have been activists and thinkers throughout the 19th and 20th century, even among some libertarian and classical liberal groups, who condemned this privilege given to corporations where the people involved were not held personally liable. But of course, there is this debate about whether this limited liability is a good thing, even though there are bad consequences that people say it secures that there are enough accumulated capital to invest in the economy, because without this limited liability, it would be too risky to accumulate capital and invest and grow the economy. So some people say it's perhaps a necessary evil. So you have this debate back and forth about whether it's legitimate or not. And some might perhaps argue that within the government as well, that yes, it's a huge problem, but to completely abolish the current system or to make all decisions by all the bureaucrats become personally held responsible, that might create problems as well. Perhaps people would be too sort of cautious, so that they don't want to make any risky decisions in the first place. So perhaps it could go too far to the extreme that people wouldn't make any decisions in government whatsoever. So of course you have this dilemma. And I think we need, as you say, to find some sort of balance, because as we have said earlier, the government today is way too big and its influence on society is way too large and comprehensible. It should be reduced and have a more civil society with civilized institutions which are not governmental, which should replace some of its institutions. So I would say that within the current government system, where the government is so large, so influential, so big, way bigger than it should be, you see that this problem with not being held personally reliable has very huge costs. So I suggest that we at least should reduce the amount of the size of government dramatically before we could have this privilege given to bureaucrats that are not held personally liable without having to have too much cost, because the bigger the government gets, the worse the problem with limited liability gets. So I suppose the size of the government has something to do with the dangers involved as well.
Interesting. I really liked many of the points that you made. So, and the first one is this thing with companies that have limited liability, which is like a heuristic construct, basically, that you can create this something called a juristic person, which is not a physical person, but some entity that has been created, and then this thing is responsible. But if it goes bankrupt, then it just vanishes again into thin air, and basically nobody is left that is responsible. And I think I myself strongly subscribe to this notion that you mentioned, that this is a bad thing. This shouldn't be the case. And I think in some form, and I also like your point about the balance, but in some form, actually not the CEO, but the, what is it called? The people that own the stocks of a company, they are responsible, they should be responsible for what this company does.
The stockholders.
The stockholders, yes. So in my mind, if I own a factory, like a small shop, and I put poisonous stuff into the ground or into the air, then I am responsible because it is my factory. Now, if I own the stocks of a large corporation that pollutes the ocean or destroys the environment in India or does any kind of horrible stuff, then I am personally responsible for this. Why? Because I own a part of this business. So I think in some sense, it is the responsibility of the stockholders to decide what their company does. And so if the CEO makes bad decisions, then the stockholders are the ones that hired him. So they are the ones that are responsible. Now, I also see the point that you said that this could lead to a problem that nobody would be willing to invest their money into anything anymore, because I don't want to invest my money into some mining company in South America, and then if there is a disaster, then I lose all my money. So I don't want to do that. So I will just keep my money, just keep piles of cash or gold coins in the bank vault and don't invest. And then this would drastically decrease the amount of capital that is invested into creating labor-saving devices, or it would drastically reduce the action of the economy. But of course, this is not only a bad thing, because many of the environmental activists today, they complain anyways that the economy is going completely rampant and using up too much resources. So maybe having some responsibility where you build and invest and what you do with your property could be very beneficial even in both of these cases together. So yes, I do think that some good balance is needed here. And I think it has to do with there needs to be some discussion in society or in the legal system about what is a reasonable requirement and what is an unreasonable requirement. So, for example, if in this case of the floor breaking beneath these houses, of the ground breaking and the houses falling down, was there any possibility that is kind of common geological knowledge to predict this? And if there was some form of common knowledge that you could have used to predict this, but someone didn't do it, then you can ask this person, why didn't you do it? But if there is no way to know this at all today, if it is just like too complicated and science is not advanced yet, then you cannot make someone responsible for something that they couldn't have known. So I think there is an important point where maybe this balance between responsibility and limited liability is to be found.
Right, yeah, very good considerations, because I certainly believe that the economy could do a lot better if the problem with limited liability as it is practiced today were dealt with and drastically reformed or changed, because we see that huge multinational corporations today have a huge amount of market power, And I believe many people are right in pointing out that this has caused a lot of problems, not only with them abusing their power through massive pollution and exploitation, and for instance, expropriating the property of poor farmers in poor countries, for instance, in Africa and in Indonesia. So that there is a huge problem with corporations, Western corporations, really exploiting people and natural places in other countries, and destroying many valuable things and persons there. So, and also you have the problem with huge transportation costs, that if you have a huge multinational corporation with so many different shops and factories all across the world, it could be argued that that's actually very inefficient, because there's so many resources and equipments that needs to be taken into account when having such an international framework for producing goods and services. So some people, like for instance the mutualists, as we briefly talked about in an earlier video, they would argue that if we abolish limited liability, we would remove, not all of course, but many of the problems related to huge multinational corporations having huge market power, and therefore people would be much more concerned with having local businesses in local markets, where it's very clear what kind of people is doing what kind of or making what kind of decisions, and the people are much more held responsible. So that would prevent this, you could say, corporate monopolistic system that is so problematic across the world. So they would argue that it would be hugely beneficial if we remove this limited liability. And yes, as you mentioned, this geological problem, as I mentioned, with the disaster that happened recently. I'm not entirely sure whether the people in government were, for instance, discussing with other experts about the ground. Perhaps there were some people who criticized them. I'm not quite sure, but I think people just let the government do whatever they want with the situation. I think people just thought this is the government responsibility, so we wouldn't deal into that. If they say it's okay, we just obey. I think the general mentality was, although I'm not quite sure. But I know of another scenario in Norway, which happened some years ago, where also there occurred a geological disaster in which the ground completely collapsed during the night. And there were 2 Polish workers on that ground that specific night, and both of them got crushed and died tragically in that disaster. And I know that the government, the local government, was warned by a geological expert who said that you need to be extremely careful. This area is risky. You cannot have people working there. You cannot build houses there because it's very risky. There could be a disaster. It could be falling apart, the whole ground. But the government ignored that person. The local government and its leader, they just ignored him because, I don't know, they thought that it was necessary for developing the local community or something like that. And then the disaster happened, the collapse. And I don't think the government really didn't have any consequences. The leader of that local government, I think she's still the leader of that government. It didn't happen anything to her, even though it was her decision not to listen to that geological expert. So here I think we see a very clear manifestation of the problem of people ignoring signs, ignoring very important warnings, and making huge mistakes. And I don't have any consequences for it. And I also remember from my own personal experience at school, the public schools, we see that there were many bureaucrats and even teachers and headmasters making very bad decisions affecting the whole school and many students and pupils. But they haven't really got into trouble because of it. And that's a huge tragedy, because there have been so many problems within the public school system in Norway with bullying, with people really struggling with their education. There have been so many problems, and the effects are very grave and problematic on the students. And yet we see that the government doesn't really change. It just continues on, because the people involved, the people making the bad decisions, they are just left out of the picture when the disaster happens.
Mm-hmm. Yes, interesting points that you brought up here. I think one important consideration here is that it is difficult because in hindsight, it is always clear what should not have been ignored. But going forward, it can be very difficult. So imagine that you just I will try to portray the other side a bit. So imagine that you are leading this local government and you have maybe limited resources and there is very big expectations from the local citizens what you should do. Everybody desires something different and you should somehow make all of this happen. And then there are also many so-called experts that may come to you and describe certain problems like this ground is not safe, or this school system is psychologically not good for the students, or the water has this problem, or like there could be hundreds of people that come to you and describe problems. And you somehow have to weigh, how do I spend the resources that I have here? Because you cannot investigate every problem with perfect precision because you don't have the resources. So I don't know the solution to this problem. And I also think that there needs to be some sort of personal responsibility involved, because I agree with your diagnosis that this is a problem, but also I see on the other side that it is very difficult, because of course in business, when a business does not make these decisions correctly, then the business goes bankrupt. So maybe it still should be that the politician that doesn't make the decision correctly also goes bankrupt. But I'm not sure. I think it's yes, let me know what you think.
Yeah, right. I would really like a system to be implemented where the politicians, if they do really bad mistakes, that would in some sense get bankrupt, as you say. But unfortunately, the government structure is such that the politicians and the bureaucrats receive massive amounts of tax money from the local, from the centralized government. So even if they do bad mistakes, the case is often that the politicians in Oslo, the capital, when they hear about some local government really doing bad things, in many cases, they think that the solution is to give the government more money because, oh, they don't have enough resources to deal with the problem. We just need to give them more tax money. So it's a very tragic phenomenon indeed that you have this reverse incentive, that people could actually be inefficient and do a bad job, and then actually convince the politicians to give them more money and more resources, because they falsely assume that the problem is too little resources, too little money, instead of how they're actually using the money for the common good. So that is also a huge problem, this very absurd incentive. And also you have this very strong bond between the local government and the central government. At least here in Norway, we have a very centralized state where the central government is sort of delegating its power to the local governments, instead of, for instance, the other way around, where local governments delegate some power to a centralized government. So you don't have a system where there is sort of self-governing entities. Unfortunately, you have a very centralized system where the central power is controlling the local power instead of the other way around. And that's a problem. And you mentioned that it should be the case that the local community, the local people, should protest against the local government if they do some bad mistakes. And that has occurred throughout Norwegian history. I don't know of any examples in my head right now, but I think that's happened. But unfortunately, often the problems are too deep. that local protests could do much good, because perhaps the government is generally inefficient, that there is some very structural problems. So yeah, perhaps they could protest, and perhaps if they are very successful, one particular individual who does harm is removed, perhaps. But still, you have the general system, the governmental structure. Perhaps the bad bureaucrat will be replaced by a new one who's equally bad or even worse. And that has certainly happened. I remember in my public schools, there were some bad bureaucrats who eventually moved to someplace else. But then the new ones replacing them weren't much better either. So I think that some people in Norway at least have the attitude that they can protest, but much of the protests is they are happening in vain, unfortunately. And we've already witnessed that in general with a huge protest in 2019 with taxing cars on the roads, and the government increased those taxes dramatically, and there were huge national protests, and they were even established a political party to deal with that problem specifically. Huge protests in Oslo and in other places. But eventually those protests died out because much didn't change. So I think people just thought, well, this is just a waste of time and money and effort. So it seems like many people are just adapting to the situation, just accepting the things the way they are. It's a very, very tragic and unfortunate situation, but that seems to be the reality as of right now.
Yes, yes. Again, I think you made many very good and important points. The first one being that, of course, it is the wrong way around, that the central government delegates some power to the local government, because this is what many people today falsely call a federalistic structure of society. But of course, there is nothing federalistic about it if the central government allows some local office to manage this or that, as long as they don't decide to intervene. Then it's just a form of management. But still, the final decision is in the hand of the central power. So this is a centralized state. And it is just a different form of administration in a centralized state. But it has nothing to do with true subsidiarity. So this is, of course, a very big problem. And then this spreads out into many other problems. Now, I think one way, and of course, this also goes with these big protests that die out, that if the power is just in the central hands, and then yes, you can spend all your free time and all your money to protest, but nothing changes. So in the end, you go back to just making your life as good as you can with the new circumstances. So yes, but I wanted to point out another, I think, important fact here. And this is the tendency that profits get privatized and costs get socialized. And this is a very old trick, and it is in every society. I think it is spread to some degree. And for me, it always smells of corruption somehow. But I think this is a general, what's the word? It is very tempting to try to put the costs onto society as a whole and take the profit for yourself. And many schemes are always devised how this can be done. And of course, governments do this to some extent, as you said. When they do a good job, then they keep their paycheck and their very secure pension no matter what. But if something goes wrong, then it is fixed with new taxpayer money. It is not fixed with the money of the person that made it go wrong. And the same with the big corporations with the limited liability. When they have a good year, then they pay out huge bonuses, and these bonuses go into private bank accounts. But then when they have a huge disaster, then the company goes bankrupt and nobody is left to pay. And in the end, some government office goes and cleans up the mess with taxpayers' money. So I think this is a huge problem, and I think this is even probably connected to the tragedy of the commons. And of course, we talked about how there are private goods and public goods. There are things that are either much more efficient or can only be provided by a group for the entire group. But there, of course, the temptation is always to try to pull something out for yourself and leave the costs to everybody else. So yes, I wonder what you think, how this connects to the problem of personal responsibility.
Yes, yeah, very good points that you brought up. And I think we could realize that personal responsibility in general is a very important value in people's private lives. They need to take responsibility over their own actions and their own life. They need to think through what they are responsible for and change that if they have some huge problems within their own lives. They need to think through, what can I do to improve the situation? And several people, for instance, Jordan Peterson, but many others as well, has pointed out the very essential role of taking responsibility over your own life. And if there are mistakes and grave errors, or you are in a very bad situation, it could be healthy to think through, okay, what have I done which might have contributed to this bad situation, and what can I do to improve it? I think that that kind of attitude is extremely important, and I think most people will agree to that, but many people struggle to actually practice that to the fullest degree. So we see this problem as a very general problem in people's private lives. And then I think when you then extend the value of personal responsibility to common goods, because we see the issue with private goods, now let's see how that works out with common goods. I think the value of personal responsibility might even get stronger, because now you're not just responsible for your own life or your own family or your own personal economy, now responsible for an entire community. So I think that people who administer and control and direct public or common goods, they should have this attitude that I am serving the people, or I am serving the community, and should have this mentality that I'm responsible for the well-being of these people. I cannot blame it on something else. I cannot blame it on other people. I am responsible, and I need to serve them and perhaps sacrifice some of my own selfish desires to serve them. That should always, of course, ideally speaking, be the attitude. But in practice, we see, because human beings are the way they are, that's not how it always works out, even though that should be encouraged to the largest degree possible. Instead, we see this very perverse incentive systems, as you could say, that massive amounts of bureaucrats live in very anonymous, faceless, centralized institutions where they receive money from people whom they don't know personally, just some abstract size of people named taxpayers, and they're using those taxpayers' money on other people or something else. They're not using it personally, or it's not their own money. I think many bureaucrats deciding how taxpayers' money is going to be used, I think they would delegate it far differently if those money came out of their own pockets. Then the incentives would dramatically change if the money involved were their own, but it's not. It's the taxpayers' money, and of course, it is sort of used in a very, very centralized and massive and messy bureaucratic system. So the personal responsibility, you could say, is spread massively across a huge number of bureaucrats, instead of personal responsibility really being felt among some particular identifiable individuals. Instead, it's just personal responsibility divided on many people, a whole class of bureaucrats and politicians. So I'm not quite sure what to do with this problem, because it's a very general problem, of course, but I think we need all to point out that personal responsibility in general is a very important virtue, and you could argue that it's even more important when you're not only responsible for yourself, but an entire community. Or in the case of a corporation where you are the CEO, you are responsible for an entire business and all people who are affected by it. So the value is also very important there as well. But as to the solution, well, as you say, we need to make people feel the burden that they are exposing to others themselves much more directly with bureaucrats and with corporations. But exact concrete solutions, that might be a bit difficult.
Yes, I like what you said, and I think this is a very good point to make, that it is not only the politicians or the bureaucrats that need to take personal responsibility, but everybody. Like every citizen, every individual needs to take personal responsibility and ask yourself, what have I done to make this bad thing come about, as you said? Because of course, many people, they want to pay as little taxes as possible and get as much benefit from the government as possible. And that's why they vote for politicians that promise them everything and then deliver almost nothing. So the people also have a responsibility in how the structure of their government locally and nationally is set up. So if it's basically, I think the sickness goes all the way through society. So if everybody desires goods without having to pay the costs or wanting to shift the cost onto others, then they will vote into office some politicians that will set into motion such schemes that should give somebody a lot of goods without them having to carry the full cost. But then at some point, always reality just shows that the cost has to be borne by someone, and then it comes crashing down again. And then instead of taking responsibility and everybody saying, okay, yes, I also added something to this problem, then you start the blame game. You start pointing the finger and trying to find someone who is now to blame, and so that I myself am then standing there with a clean shirt. But so of course, this is not a concrete solution, but I think the problem runs through the entire society. There is not just a lack of personal responsibility in the politicians, but maybe in everybody.
Right. As you say, well, we see this as a general problem with human beings, generally speaking. So I think people in general taking personal responsibility over their own lives, if everyone pursued that goal, I think the world would get much better. But because human beings are the way they are, it's a struggle, it's a difficulty. So it's something that everyone needs to work with. And I also know in my own personal life that there are many things and situations in which I could take personal responsibility, but it's very easy to blame the situation on someone else. And actually, you should take responsibility over that situation, because then you can do something about it. And I think even if you actually aren't responsible for a certain situation, if the problem is actually because of someone else, even taking responsibility over those things could be a healthy thing, because then you at least try your best to improve the situation and have a healthy and sustainable attitude. So I think even in those cases where you aren't actually responsible for things, you could still take responsibility and act as if it is all on you, to the degree that it's possible and doesn't, of course, damage you too much. But yes. So yeah, I suppose, as we have talked about earlier, Political solutions in general might be to localize more, to decentralize the government instead of having a very centralized entity with massive amounts of bureaucrats where personal responsibility is just divided among many people and not really felt personally by anyone. So there should be this possibility of people really holding individual people accountable. So perhaps in some way or another they could sue specific bureaucrats or specific politicians for their work instead of just suing the state as an abstract entity in general. So perhaps there should be some changes in the court system to secure that specific individuals are sued and must pay from their own pockets instead of the government getting sued. And if they win, which they, and even if the people suing them win, as they actually very rarely do, then instead of just the government using more taxpayer money to pay them, they should pay from their own pockets. And I know many cases from the Norwegian Child Protection Agency, where this agency has done huge amounts of damage, taking people's children in cases where that's not necessary at all, or neglecting situations where they should take care of the children, where the parents are bad parents or something. There are so many cases where that agency has been sued, but the people have either lost, or even if they win, you just get a sum of money from the taxpayers. So in that agency, we see very clearly that people involved are not sued personally. And if they were, I think we'd see a lot of things different in that kind of agency. So yes, general solutions, just localize, decentralize the government, try to make it the case that people can sue specific individuals and hold specific individuals accountable. And as we have mentioned earlier, the subsidiarity principle, make the government smaller, let it have less tasks, and let other institutions have more say and influence on how the government, not the government, but society should be organized, and have more autonomy over their own institutions instead of having government sort of absorbing all other tasks. So just pursuing those goals in general would be a good idea.
Yes, very good summary, I think, of what kind of political or institutional solutions that we have discussed for this problem of personal responsibility. I would just want to add one more, which I think is also essential, and maybe it's even like the head of the fish. You should be allowed, or it should be possible to sue politicians if they do not fulfill what they promised when you vote for them. Because I think there it starts and then it trickles down. So if I vote for some politician and he says, I will address this or that problem in society, then as soon as he is in his government seat, he never does anything to address this problem, then I should be allowed to sue him personally, and it should hurt also him personally in his personal finances. And then this politician, when he makes a law or a whatever, an arrangement, then he gives a task to certain people, and then if these people don't fulfill that task, they again should be held responsible personally by the guy that gives them the order. So it's just like in a corporation, basically, where the stockholders, control the CEO, and the CEO controls the other team leaders, and the team leaders control the project leaders, and the project leaders control the individual workers. That's how it should also be in government. So the people, the citizens, they are the stockholders. We own this corporation, to speak in this metaphor, and then we elect some people as CEO, as politicians, to do a certain job, and if they don't, then we should be able to hold them personally accountable, and then the responsibility flows downward over each stage. So I think this could be a like a starting point how this problem could be improved. And yes, also everybody should take personal responsibility themselves. I think this is not an institutional solution, but it's also very important.
Right, and also if I can add something, that this is a huge problem, this lack of personal responsibility in the government, as we have discussed, but it should also be mentioned that this is a problem to some degree in the corporate world as well, that CEOs and people within huge corporations doing much harm to other people, exploiting people or polluting rivers and the air, for instance, we should also, if not abolish, at least dramatically reduce or reform this limited liability system in which people are bearing the burden of their own corporate decisions far more than they do today. I think that will be very healthy in undermining this very multinational monopolistic structure in the economy. So also in the private economy, I think there are certainly needs for personal responsibility, just as in government, and doing something about this limited liability privilege and this legal fiction. So that should be emphasized as well.
Yes, good point. So yes, I think this kind of rounds off this conversation, at least, about personal responsibility. Yes, thank you very much for coming here and discussing this with me. It was, as always, a very interesting conversation and a pleasure.
Yes, absolutely, and thanks for having me on.
Great. So we will see each other another time again.
Yes, we will. So have a good day on, and a good new year, we could say.
Yes, exactly. Happy New Year to you and also to the audience.
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
Great.
see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.